I just want to see if I have just, okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 26th ERF Annual Conference webinar, the theme of Sustainable Development Goal. Unfortunately, we couldn't meet in person, but thanks to technology, we are able to do such an interesting webinar. Today, I will be the moderator and the discussant. I am Rasha Ramadan, Associate Professor at Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University, and ERF researcher. And we have two interesting papers by Zuhair Mrabat and Lynn, and we'll start by Zuhair's paper. Zuhair, would you start by sharing your screen, please? You have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. It's okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to present my paper titled The Impact of Socio-Economic Development and Political Instability on the Environment Degradation in the MENA region. My presentation, so this paper is co-authored with Dr. Muayyid Al-Samara. My presentation will be in 6 points. Okay. I will start by an introduction. After that, I will give you a brief overview of the relationship between environment degradation and economic development in the MENA region. After that, I will give you a brief literature review. And the fourth point, I will present the data, empirical and empirical methodology, following by the empirical results. And finally, I will present the conclusion and policy implication. So since the Industrial Revolution and until a few decades ago, the objective of sustainable economic development in many regions of the world is achieved in expense of environment degradation. And in center of this alarming environmental concerns, the EKC hypothesis developed by Kroeger and Grossman and Kroeger in 1991 give an optimistic expectation on the relationship between environment degradation and economic development. However, according to this EKC hypothesis, the economic development have two stages. The first stage is more economic development will cause an increase of environment degradation. But after a certain level of economic development, more economic development will cause a decrease in the environment degradation. However, this EKC literature focuses on the GDP per capita as a key variable to achieve environmental enhancements and ignore the social dimension considered as a pillar of sustainable development. At the same time, the theoretical and empirical literature combining the economic and social perspectives are relatively scant, with a few exceptions. So in this paper, we assume that that sustainable development can occur by improving the social dimension along with the income dimension. More importantly, we think that political stability is an important factor in materializing the benefit of economic development on the environment without significant delays may occur. So to illustrate this idea, we use the Human Development Index, HDI, as a proxy of economic development. This index tracks the country's achievement in terms of durability, life expectancy rate, education accessibility, and income level. And we will use also as a measure or as a proxy of environment degradation, the ecological footprint. Let's now see a brief overview of the environment degradation and economic development relationship in the MENA region. So this figure 1, display the patterns of HDI, Human Development Index, and the ecological footprint for 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2016. Overall, we can observe that the Human Development Index increase year by year in the MENA region. But when we see what happened at the level of one country, we can see that for some country they have succeeded in reducing the ecological footprint while improving the HDI, including Morocco, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Some others have widespread a slight increase in both HDI and ERF indicators, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, and Turkey. Other countries like Sudan, Syria, Libya, and Yemen have experienced a substantial decline in their HDI index and EF, ecological footprint, and these countries were concerned or directly impacted by the Arabic uprising in 2011. Other countries, the situation is stable, like Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, and Algeria, before and after the Arabic uprising 2011. Let's move now to the literature review. So in general, these studies, when they study the relationship between the environment degradation and economic development, they use the CO2 emissions as a proxy of environment degradation and GDP per capita as a proxy of economic development. And overall, their results show there is a long-run relationship between both variables. But their funding are mixed and vary according to the methodology used, the time period, and the selected variable included in the model. Our data are extracted from World Bank development indicators and from footprint network database from 1990 to 2016 for 16 countries in the MENA region. All variables are expressed in logs. The control variables are trade, energy consumption, and urbanization. So to study the relationship between ecological footprint and the Human Development Index in the MENA region, this paper employed the panel VAR methodology as a first step. This methodology has several advantages. The more important are that the PVAR method uses a system of equation where all variables are treated as endogenous. In our case, there is 5 variables, which means 5 equations, and all variables are endogenous. The second advantage of this method is that we can study the response of one variable to the shock of other variable. So in our case, we will concentrate on just on one equation, the equation of ecological footprint. Okay. So the estimation of this result is displayed in this table. So we run the estimation for 3 samples, the full samples. So for this full sample, we can observe that the HDI, Human Development Index, has a negative and significant impact on the ecological footprint, which means that a better Human Development Index is beneficial to the environment and appears to help reducing harmful emissions and mitigating any pressure on natural resources. The estimation of PVAR for oil-producing countries and non-oil countries give us an interesting result. For oil-producing countries, the impact is negative, same as the full sample, and significant. But for the non-oil countries, the impact is positive, 1.1, and significant. And this interesting result means that there is a nonlinear relationship between EF and HDI, which means that some country in the MENA region are in the first stage of development, when more economic development will cause environment degradation, and other countries, the majority of oil producing countries, are in the second stage of development, where more economic development, more HDI will decrease the environment degradation. So this intuition of non-linearity relationship between HDI and the EF variable is confirmed by the empirical assessment function for the full sample and for the both subsample oil-producing countries and non-oil countries. So the first result is that there is a non-linear relationship between, in the MENA region, between HDI and EF. So to investigate further this non-linear relationship, we test the EKC hypothesis. And the EKC hypothesis is that there is an inverted U shape between the environment degradation and the economic development. So in this, to test this EKC hypothesis, we will estimate two equations. The first equation is the basic equation of EKC hypothesis, where the variable measuring the environment degradation is at the left of the left-right of the equation, and the variable measuring the economic development is at the right with the squared variable to capture the nonlinearity effect. In the second equation, we augment the first equation by the dummy variable, 3 dummy variables, to capture and to test if there is any effect of the 2011 uprising on the relationship between EF and HDI. So the estimation of two equations for full sample oil-producing countries and non-oil countries is presented in this table. Overall, the results show that there is an inverted U-shape relationship between EF and HDI, which means there is non-linear relationship between both variables, which is standard in the literature. But the new result is that there is a shift in the turning point when we introduce the dummy variable of 2011 Arab uprising, which means that according to this funding, and after the 2011 uprising, countries would need to achieve a higher HDI to experience a better environment quality. Hence, the existence of a decoupling between EF and HDI that would slow down the convergence to the turning point and require more resources to attain environmental improvement. As a conclusion and policy implication, our results reveal that the ecological footprint is strongly impacted by the level of the Human Development Index, suggesting that policymakers are more likely to achieve a sustainable development when the HDI improves. We show that there exists an inverse relationship between EF and HDI, where environmental enhancements can only be attained beyond a certain level of HDI, turning point, without harming the natural resources. We also found that other factors affect the environment footprint, including trade, energy consumption, and urbanization. Our study reveals that improving the HDI is a viable policy tool and represents a step forward to sustainable development. The 2011 Arab uprising has impacted the EF-HDI relationship by shifting its turning point upward. Thus, due to the uprising, MENA countries need a higher level of HDI to start experiencing environmental improvements. Political instability may therefore jeopardize the efforts of a country to attain the sustainable development goals. And thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuhair, for your presentation. Just let me make an announcement. If you have any question, please, you can raise your hand, or you can just send me the question in the chat box and I will read it. So now I will discuss the paper of Zuhair, but before starting the discussion, let me present Zuhair. It's late, but I forgot to say it in the beginning. So Zuhair Mrabet got his PhD in economics from the University of Paris-Est Marne-la-Vallée in France in 2010. His current position, he is an associate professor at Qatar University. His research interests includes trade liberalization, labor market, monetary policy, and economic development and environment. He has several publications such as economic modeling, annal of operation research, and environmental science and pollution research. Okay, so now I will start discussing the paper. So thank you, Zuhair, for this paper.
Thank you.
It's very interesting. I really enjoyed reading it. So I will skip the overview of the paper because you already did it. So take my discussion mode as a suggestion, trying to improving the paper and taking for first step. So first is interesting results of non-linear relationship between HDI and EF. It would be confirmed if you change your environmental variable. I mean, if you use CO2 or SO2, the two variables also used in the literature, would you still have the same results or not, the same nonlinear relationship and the difference between oil and non-oil countries? Also, I think it would be interesting to present, even as robustness checks, the difference between the relation between the GDP per capita and ecological footprint, because I think just to see if we know that we have difference in the development level between the different countries, but also we have different growth level. So what would be the results of this?
Okay, thank you.
I think also other variables can be included in your models that would affect also your Y variables, such as population, financial development, institutional environment, because this also are factors that may affect your EF or whatever environmental variable you'll be using. For the 2011 uprising, I think it's very interesting and it's very important, and it shows that we have kind of being behind because of this, but just including a dummy variable equal 1 after 2011, I don't think it's really reflect the Arab uprising, especially that the impact of the Arab uprising was not the same between all countries. I mean, the situation in Egypt after 2011 is not like in Tunisia, it's not like in Syria or in Sudan. So I think including variable about conflict, for instance, or trying to include other variables that would really capture the situation after 2011 and the difference between the different countries, it will add more value for trying to capture this effect of this uprising. One of the questions that you motivate your topic with in the introduction, and that was really interesting to see how you will answer it, is what are the possible pathways and scenarios for MENA countries to really improve or to improve their situation, especially after the Arab uprising. And I don't think really you answered this question. And this is related to my last comment, is that your policy recommendations require more elaboration. We need to see, okay, we have non-linear relationship. Oil exporting countries are in better situations than non-exporting countries, but okay, so what? What are the policy recommendations that you can provide for policymakers to improve the situation, especially in such a context? And for instance, in your discussion in the paper, you explained that for some countries, they were able to improve their HDI and reduce their EF, like Morocco, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. So what is difference in these countries makes them improve their situation? Are specific institutional framework, specific regulations that they apply that allows them to achieve this or not? So I think this needs to be explored more in the paper, especially for the concluding remark.
Maybe in this conclusion, yes. For the scenario, maybe for the scenario will be another paper to talk about the scenarios possible for these countries.
Okay. Thank you, Zuhair. So now we have a question from Dr. Shahir Zaki. Dr. Shahir, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rasha, for your presentation. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions and suggestions regarding the empirics of the paper. First, I think if when you include the squared term of HDI in your econometric specification is significant, this means that that's the one that you have to stick to, because this means that the other specifications might be biased. So I think you have to include both HDI and the square term along with the other controls, because perhaps I'm mistaken, but I understood that in your presentation, when you included the square term, you removed the other controls. Mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, in any case, you have to include both the controls and the square term. And then you said that the effect of HDI over your environmental performance variable is an inverted U shape. I don't think that's the case, because according to your results, the effect of HDI was negative, and then the square term was also negative, which means that it's it's decreasing at a decreasing rate, so it's exponential, not inverted U.
The sign of okay.
I mean, in your regressions, the coefficient of HDI for both the level and the square term were negative, right?
Yeah, were negative, but we are concentrated on the sign of HDI squared is negative.
Yes, it's negative. So the HDI is negative, and the square term is also negative, right?
Yeah, exactly. Is negative. Both are negative. Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, both are negative. Yeah.
Yes, so this means that it's not an inverted U, because in order to, I mean, if it is inverted U, this means that it will be negative and then positive. So the square term must be positive, not negative.
I think if for the inverted U shape is just to concentrate on the sign of squared term. If it's negative, so the shape is inverted U shape is inverted U.
No, but because I mean you base your analysis based on the two coefficients. You will take the second derivative of your equation. I mean, so mm-hmm. And that's why, for instance, when we have an inverted U, the first coefficient must be positive, and the second one must be negative. You get my point? Because this means that first it's increasing, but then it starts to increase at a decreasing rate, which means that at a certain point after the threshold, it will start to decrease. But I cannot say that the second derivative is negative, while the first one is also negative, and then conclude that it's an inverted U. So I think you have to revise this. And I totally agree with Rasha that you have to control for the quality of institutions, because there are fundamental differences in the quality of institutions between the group of countries that you include. For instance, Morocco has undertaken several institutional reforms, which is not the case of most of the other countries. And then I think it will be also interesting to avoid splitting your sample into two subsamples, because I think the positive effect of HDI in your oil exporters and the negative effect of HDI on emissions in oil importers can be driven by the fact that you have too small samples. So perhaps you can overcome this by introducing an oil dummy and interact this with HDI in order to avoid splitting the sample into two subsamples. And finally, I think from a policy perspective, it will be interesting, given the fact that you're running a panel VAR, then that you run some impulse response functions and variance decomposition, just to show to what extent the changes in environmental performance will be driven by changes in the development of a country. So the variance decomposition will really add a lot from a policy perspective.
Okay.
And thank you.
Yes, all right, yeah.
Thank you, Shahil.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So there are other two questions in the Q&A. I will read it for you, and then you can answer Shahil's question. And so we have two questions from Mohammed Visal. Given the small sample of countries and the fact that many factors move together, how can you claim causality? And what are the exact restrictions for identification of the VAR model? We cannot have all endogenous variables. There has to be some exogenous variables of restrictions to estimate variables.
Yeah, yes, for the causality, we ran the causality test for this model, and we found that there is a causality between EF and HDI. There is bidirectional causality between both EF and HDI, and between EF and all variables, bidirectional causality between all these variables. For the second questions, so when we identify our model, VAR model, so we use we start by the variable that is more exogenous to variable more endogenous, and we re-estimate several PVAR. When we reorder the variables, and we get the same result for the HDI coefficient. Thank you. Thank you for the. It's okay. There is another question?
No, that's it.
Okay, thank you. I wish that it's okay. It's clear.
Thank you, Zuhair. Okay, so now we'll move to our second paper by Lynn Wilfrey. So Lynn is a data scientist with more than 20 years experience curating and sharing disaggregated African data. She managed data operations at Data First, a data service and research unit based at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She is responsible for Africa's only core trust seal certified data repository. In 2012, she set up the only secure research data center in Africa to give researchers controlled access to sensitive or highly disaggregated government data. She trained data managers in government and research institutions across Africa and have participated in UN projects to assist governments to assess their data readiness for SDGs planning and monitoring. Her research field of interest is open government data and information ecosystems for data-directed decisions making in African countries. Lynn, you have the floor. You can share your presentation, and you have 15 minutes.
Can you unmuted myself? I'm just going to share my screen.
You are already unmute. We can hear you.
Yeah, excellent. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet.
Okay, let me just open my presentation. Okay, let me share it.
We still can't see it.
Coming up.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
No, not really.
Okay, I'm just trying to figure out why I can't share it. Okay, let's try that again.
If you can't share it, I can share it. I have the presentation.
I'm just trying to get back to Zoom. I don't know why I can't see the Zoom screen. It's only giving me two options: start and leave. I don't want to do either. Let me just see if I can open the. There we go. Yeah. Okay. So there we go. Let's just share my screen. Okay, here we go. Right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent, okay.
But it's not the presentation yet, it's just your folder.
Oh.
I mean, we can see the screen, yeah, but there is no presentation.
Strange, I can see it. Okay, let me just minimize this. See why? It says I'm screen sharing.
Yeah, but maybe you specify in the screen sharing to share only the folder. You have to allow sharing the PowerPoint presentation or whatever you are opening on your screen.
Yes, well, it is open. Let me just check. You should be able to see whatever's on my screen, right?
Yes, we can see only your folder.
That's so strange. Let me try that again.
Unshare and share it. Otherwise, I can share it from my computer if you want. If it's the same presentation, you already sent it to us.
Slightly different. Let me just close it and open it again.
Okay.
There we go. Can you see it now?
No.
Okay, so I can see why.
Okay, just for sake of time, let me share what I have.
Okay, no problem. That's really weird.
Can you see it?
That's fine, yes.
Okay, just tell me and I will move the...
Okay, thank you. Okay, so, well, I hope I get, that everybody is going to listen to mine as intently as they listen to his. So, this is good. As you know, I run a research data center and open data repository at the University of Cape Town. So my job is basically to, DataFirst works in the research policy interface. And my job is to encourage governments across Africa to share their data with academia for policy research. And DataFirst was set up in 2001, and we've been sharing data online, not just South African data, but data from other African countries as well. Since 2009, we've been online. And so we have 12,000 registered users on our platform. Do you want to go to the next slide? So what I'm going to discuss today is a project I did with the UN, investigating the capacities of selected African governments to report on the indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. So you all know that the UNSD put together, after the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed on by every government in the world, the United Nations Statistics Division, along with the stats officers of different countries, put together a list of indicators that governments could use to assess their proximity to attainment of the goals and their targets. And so what we did was we visited 2 African countries, and I did an online search for Egypt, and we looked at accessibility and quality of data held by governments to inform either monitoring or monitoring of the SDG achievement, or actually the planning for SDGs. So the UN project was focused more on making indicators available for monitoring purposes, but obviously that if they are available, they would feed into planning as well. Okay, next slide. So this is just a quick example. Obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals need targets, and these have been agreed on by all governments. And this particular one is just an example, just to show you where we started. This is an example of Goal 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. But obviously, what does that mean? So there need to be targets that governments can aim for to achieve this particular goal. And I've just highlighted two of the targets. The first one is by 2030, because obviously that's the cutoff date for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. By 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services, and upgrade slums. And the indicator for that is a proportion of urban population living in slums, informal settlements, or in inadequate housing. So that is what we were focused on. We focused on the indicator. Do governments have this indicator? Have they published this indicator for their country? If they don't have it, are they working to collect data to acquire the data for that particular indicator, for that data point? And obviously, if you look at this, there's more to it than just saying, okay, I need to get that data. I mean, what does living in slums mean? How do you define informal settlement? What is inadequate when you're talking about housing? And if you have a look at the UNSD indicator list, each indicator now has metadata to explain the various aspects of the indicator, to make it easier for governments to know what indicator to use, know what data to collect, and know what data points to publish. Okay, next slide. And then what we looked at was, well, we initially looked at how well are African governments doing in SDG reporting. So the aspect that we were considering was reporting more than planning. And so the project attempted to quantify government's abilities to report on the SDGs. And this is just a World Bank page which talks about, investigates how well the world is doing. Unfortunately, they don't break it down into by country, but that's what we were looking at. Okay, next slide. So here's an example. This is from the World Bank site. This is a particular indicator, share of urban population living in slums. So it comes from that SDG on cities, sustainable cities. And quite a lot has been written about the indicators are often outdated or difficult to trace to source for some countries. And here's a good example. So this was published in 2017, or end of 2017, and you can see that the share of urban population living in slums, the figure is for 2014. So you can see we're already out of date with regard to our reporting on this particular indicator. There is quite a bit of metadata for the indicator, but often governments publish the indicators with no indication of where the data source is. Where does this data point come from? Here is a figure that you have published on the share of urban population living in slums in your country, but we need to make this data quality data. We need to be able to follow the trail back to the original data source and preferably access the data source so we can interrogate these data points for indicators for countries. Next slide. And then and quite a lot has been written about the misalignment of national goals and Sustainable Development Goals, the international versions of the Sustainable Development Goals. And obviously, when the SDGs were agreed on by governments, they were agreed at that particular level and with those particular targets. So what the literature finds is that the targets and goals haven't been aligned locally. Obviously, governments can make their own targets, but they need to. It seems a lot of work if all governments have sat down and agreed on targets, indicators, goals, to now diverge quite a lot from the targets that you're setting for your country. And this was a UNDP, what's known as a rapid assessment, which makes me a bit nervous because rapid sounds like not much work went into it. But anyway, here, this is just for Zambia, and the assessment came to the conclusion that only 52% of the Zambia's National Development Plan targets were aligned with the targets for the SDGs. And also, there was also an issue about the Zambian indicators. The ones that were published were not actually published at the required level of disaggregation. So the indicator list specifies how the indicators should be broken down. So yes, you can provide the number of children completing school, but that also needs to be disaggregated by gender. And the specific indicator needs to have those specific disaggregations. So if the government is reporting on those indicators, they need to report them at the level of disaggregation that is required. And I'll go more into that in my paper, which we can discuss afterwards. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these were the readiness assessments that are carried out. So the first two were done in Zimbabwe and Zambia in September and October 2018, and the assessment of the government of Egypt's abilities to report was an online assessment done last year. So the assessments for Zambia and Zimbabwe were part of a UNSD project on SDG monitoring, and it was only a subsection of the full project. The full project tackles SDG planning and looks at SDG data needs, not just from the point of view of data gaps, but also from the point of view of building data platforms for agencies that agencies can use to collect data, to collate data, and also to publish data. But this particular project was a detailed investigation of data gaps and data readiness. Okay, so a little bit of background of my skills for this particular job. So I did this work as a consultant for the UN Stats Division. Obviously, drawing on my 20 years of working with data in Africa, running Data First's repository, which, and as I discussed earlier on, our open data repositories gives data out to the world. So we collect African data, but obviously it's not, because it's an open data repository, the data is available for academic research to the wider academic community. And we've got international certification, so we're obviously doing something right. And we have an advantage because we are in a university. We get to work very closely with socioeconomic researchers involved in socioeconomic policy research, and that has given us a very good idea of what is needed for policy research in terms of data. Obviously, when we're talking open, we're talking microdata. There are a lot of open African data platforms that are not actually open because it's not good enough to make the data available. To be open, the data needs to be available at a very disaggregated level. And so we are not interested in providing aggregated data. There are lots of platforms for that. You can get a lot of aggregated data from stats offices, from the websites of stats agencies. We're concerned with giving policy researchers like yourselves detailed data so that you can get a really good picture of the socioeconomic situations in different countries. And as I said before, we also provide training in data analysis, but also in data handling for data quality. Okay, next slide. Oh, right. So the analysis that we did, I worked within the confines of the UNSD's metrics, so which had already been decided on before I started the project with them. And it was based on a count, so it was a very bold metric. It was based on a count of SDG indicators that governments were able to report on using government sources. So that was one of the requirements. We weren't interested in SDG indicators for a country that have been compiled by the World Bank or the IMF, which are not necessarily drawn from government data. In other words, we were interested in the official sources of data. Because obviously the World Bank reports a lot on different countries and reports across countries. And often if they're missing data points, they will impute the data points. And we specifically wanted to see what data was available from the official data sources in the countries. We looked at all 232 unique SDG indicators, which were agreed by the UN Statistics Commission in 2018. And I noticed now, I looked today on their website and I see that it's gone down to 231. So I'm not too sure which indicator seems to have fallen off the edge. There are in fact 247 indicators, but some indicators repeat for different targets. So there are 232 or now 231 unique SDG indicators. As I said, we used a predefined UN Stats Division metric, just looking at the percentage of SDG indicators which either are already posted somewhere by the government or can easily be reported on. And I'll explain how we defined easily. The assessments in Zimbabwe and Zambia involved 4 days of in-country meetings with representatives of government agencies. And we were very lucky in that, we were very fortunate in that we had a link person in each stats agency who managed to put together representatives from quite a wide variety of agencies who met with us. And actually this being my area of research, it was actually quite a privilege to be able to talk to people and see what they were knowledgeable about. And particularly in the stats offices, we got to talk to some of the survey project heads, and they were exceptionally knowledgeable and helpful about what they were doing, and also gave us quite a lot of detail about new questions that are being added to standard questionnaires for annual or biannual surveys in order to collect data that can report on indicators for SDG attainment. One big area of data gaps is disability. So this is the same in South Africa. African governments have not been collecting data on the disabled. And this has really impacted on the ability to report on disability stats for the indicators, and also to develop policies. So what a lot of the agencies have done is they've added disability questions to their household surveys or their living conditions surveys. And that was very interesting to have those discussions. And where I could, we did a review of data sources being used for indicators. I'd just like to say that that was not the original part of the assessment method, which I found rather alarming. So the UNSD, the other countries that they had assessed, the other governments that they had assessed, they did not go back and check on the data sources. So they relied quite heavily on the agency's reporting on which indicators they had, which data sources provided those indicators, and where they had been published. But I added a dimension because this is my field, and because also I have a lot of data from both those, from Zimbabwe and Zambia, so I could check on the data points that had been that were reported on.
Lynn, you have 2 minutes left.
Woo, okay, you can go to the next slide. I think that's probably the most important one. So we looked at the data that has already been compiled and published, the data that is easy to compile, and by that definition we meant could it be done with existing data in the next 3 to 5 years? The data that could be compiled with a lot of support, and obviously that's from the UN agencies' support, and data that cannot be compiled, indicators that cannot be compiled because the data just does not exist in the country. And obviously we left out indicators that were not applicable to the country. For instance, Zambia and Zimbabwe, both landlocked countries, so the indicators related to SDGs related to the oceans, they hadn't done. Next slide. And so there's an example this is just a very bold outline of the unique indicators, which ones were not applicable to the country, which ones were applicable, which were currently available, and we asked for links to those, which are easy to compile and which could be compiled with a lot of support, and basically support meant funding, as it usually does, because this data collection costs money. And then the SDGs that governments are not even attempting to compile because either they have no data or, you know, there are issues around the actual indicator. And then the percentage is just the percentage of indicators that are either have been compiled or can be compiled. And the same with the Zimbabwean government. Okay, next slide. And then I did the same thing for the Egyptian government, obviously not being able to talk to agents, to representatives from agencies. So this is very much done from reports. So the Egyptian government, as other governments, has produced a SDG assessment report, and they're all available on the UNSD website. And I used the CAPMAS figures from the Egyptian report for 2018. They're not directly comparable because the indicators reported on include the non-unique indicators. So they're not directly comparable with the Zambian and Zimbabwean data, but as you can see, there's quite a consistent pattern. Next slide. Then there were some interesting questions asked. This was reporting role. Now, usually the stats agencies are the coordinators of data collection in most countries. That's just the model that most countries use. And here you can see this is very much the case, is that the workload is falling largely on stats officers, and I'm sure it's much the same with CAPMAS. So the currently available data, almost all of it has been collected by the stats officers. They are hopeful with the easily collected data that as in Zambia, that the load will be shared almost equally, or in Zimbabwe that the other agencies will take more of the load. I think this might be a little bit optimistic because there is a pattern of the ministers expecting the stats agencies to do this type of reporting. Next slide. We can leave it.
Lynn, yes, I could have like 1 minute to conclude. So
okay. Do you want to go to the last slide then? Because I can show again when there are questions. Okay, one back.
This one?
This one, yes. Oh, sorry, the one before?
This one?
Yeah. So the Cape Town Global Action Plan for Sustainable Development Data recommends that country-level values for indicators of SDG progress should be made available by governments through transparent and public access. The problem is that what I found was that where the data is already available, the indicators have been published, but there's still a huge data gap as far as African governments publishing their indicators. We can go to the next one if I have half a minute. For example, in Zimbabwean government's voluntary national SDG review, they cite of the 30 of the 34 data graphs cite publicly available data that is their data, but that is also available somewhere else. So it seems that although they are not sharing their data online, the data that they report from is all data that is shared online. So what's happening is that governments are finding it easier to report on their own data that is shared somewhere else than the data they hold locally, because it is not well curated and easily accessible. And then just to say that the limitations of the assessment were that it was very brief. It's always, as you all know, any of these UN interventions are always one size fits all, which doesn't necessarily work. You do need to tailor any intervention to suit the needs of the government and the agencies involved. As I said, with the other projects in which I wasn't involved, they would take at face value what the agency said about what data they had, what had been published, and where the data sources were. So we didn't do that because A, I have most of the Zimbabwean data, and B, I used, in the case of Zambia and Egypt, I used a lot of online reports to assess which data was available and the particular indicators. There's also an emphasis with the UN and the World Bank on technological solutions. Technology, you can throw technology at governments as much as you like, but you need to have that commitment and institutionalization of data sharing, data exchange, and data availability to really make a difference.
Thank you, Lynn.
Sure.
Okay. So let me now share my discussion.
I'm just going to turn my screen because it's a very sunny place where I live.
That's nice. Very nice view.
There's a little bit of the mountain there.
Wow, very nice view. So again, let me just remind the attendees you can ask questions through the Q&A box, or you can just raise your hand. Okay. So thank you, Lynn, for this very interesting paper. I would really call it more a report more than a paper. It does not have the typical academic paper. But however, it includes a lot of very interesting information. And as we were talking in the beginning before starting our sessions, that for researchers, data is really important. Sometimes data exists, variables exist, but they are not available or not accessible, and sometimes they do not exist at all. And I think if we need really to, for governments to define more policies and strategies to achieve the SDG goals, we need the data to be able to measure the progress and to see how far are we from our goals. So okay, I will spend. So the first thing that in the paper, you didn't really motivate well why it's important to know this. I mean, why it's important to know if Egypt is ready for monitoring data to achieve SDGs or not. It's not the sake only of having data. Is, as you said in your last slide, that it's important to have data being accessible and be able to use it, because when researchers and government use data, we'll be able to provide based evidence policies and strategies to achieve our goals. So I think in the paper, you need to motivate it better to explain why it's important to have this data and make it available in the same time.
Oh yeah, in my final paper I do, obviously.
Okay. Second thing is the choice of countries. I really didn't get why these 3 countries. I mean, if you already use online reports for Egypt, you would be able to use it for other countries. You did motivate in the paper why you focus on the 3 countries, what is very specific about the 3 ones. And what I would suggest is that you can do the same thing for other African countries and focus on all countries of our continent and try to compare between them to see what is the difference in level of data readiness and what factors make one country more ready, more data ready than another one. Because otherwise, it's not clear why only these 3 governments. I think
okay.
also.
Well, I can answer that. Those were the ones. Yeah.
Okay, let me finish all, and then you can. I will give you time to answer all together. Okay. Other thing related to this, I think it would be interesting to show some statistics about these countries. I mean, the 3 countries or whatever other countries will include, to be able to compare the different development levels of these countries, what they achieve in the different goals, because sometimes they're not really comparable. So I would not be able to understand why one country is data ready than another one, if the institutional framework is different, the development level is different. So I think it would be important to see some statistics just to see the difference between countries studied. And the other thing, you were talking in the paper about readiness for data, but in general, I mean, in your presentation, it was very interesting to start with this example with goal number 11, because I believe for each goal, the variables will be different and availability will be different. Data that will, or variables we'll use for poverty and inequality will not be the same if for women empowerment and climate change. For some variables or some data, we already have huge amount of data and are accessible. For others, it's not the case. So I think it's important to differentiate between the different goals and not talking about data readiness as if it's general for all the goals and for all the variables available. My last comment is that when you were discussing about the data sources in the paper, you said that you focused more on data that is available based on official Bureau de Statistique or official sources from the country. And you kind of ignore data that is available through UN sites or other sites. I think it's important to present the different types of availability. I mean, if data is available even at UN site and not as the government or the official institutions, it at least a kind of improvement compared to data that does not exist at all. So I think you need to discuss this and why for some data it's available on UN site and not on in the official websites. And if data is not available at all, what are the main reasons behind this and how can we improve this to be able to achieve the SDG goals? And this is the end of my discussion. So I will give you time to answer. And again, if anyone has any question or...
sorry, Rasha, can I see your questions? Yeah, can you put the questions?
Sure. Okay.
Thank you. Short memory.
No.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so Zambia, so I don't like to talk about what I don't know about. So the reason that these 3 countries is, first of all, I'm doing a project on North Africa and it involves data. The other 2, I went to the countries. So I felt like I could speak about them. I mean, I visited them a lot and worked very closely with the stats officers. So I have done a continent-wide assessment of accessibility, because obviously accessibility is the lodestone of quality. If data is not, there's plenty of data out there. There's plenty of data held by governments, but if it's not accessible, it might as well not exist. So I did do a big study, which is actually, it's a technical paper on our website, looking at trying to get data from every single stats office in every single country. And that was very interesting because you could see the levels of openness and you could see the levels of data readiness. And well, there are many reasons. Obviously, resources is a very under-resourced. Most stats offices are severely under-resourced. Government commitment, both those make a huge difference. In South Africa, because we've had over the years government commitment to making the data available for policy research. There's also been money that has gone into the stats offices to ensure that the data is available. What was the other question? I agree, some more detail about the development levels of the country is very important. What was your last point? It's gone out of my head now. Oh yes, looking at data from, oh, here we go. Well, you see, so that was the brief of the UN, is to look at only official data. And the other thing, there's been a lot written about imputed data. It's quite controversial, that the data that appears on the World Bank site and the IMF site is some of it's quite strongly debated. So we circumvented that by saying, okay, we would only look at data that the government themselves has agreed on, that this is their official data point. Because you get a lot of rejection of the data that is available in World Bank sites and UN sites, because it's not necessarily just reported on by governments. Where there are data gaps, there's often quite a bit of imputation. But that was the brief of the UN project anyway, so I didn't go outside the brief. But obviously that is something that's interesting. There are people whose interest is exactly that. How accurate is the imputed data that is made available on international websites? It's different with something like DHS or the living standards measurement surveys, because they are reported on by international organizations, but they are local data that's been collected by government agencies.
But I think it's a very important point to discuss in your paper, to clarify that if it's imputed or if it exists but not really agreed or accepted by governments, it's important.
Yeah,
because as I said, if data does not exist at all in any website or in any source at all, I think this is important, that we need to know why it's not. Yes.
The problem is that sometimes the data is, look, mostly the data exists. It's just not available. It's accessibility more than gaps, really. The gaps are caused by lack of good data management and lack of availability and transparency. But where the data doesn't exist at all and you get the wrong imputed indicator, you can see what happens. And I've seen that with data that's quoted from sources and then requoted and it ends up, nobody knows where it comes from. So it's always important to have the source, and particularly to have, and this is something we raised over and over again in the assessment, it's very important to provide a link to the source. Even if the source data is hard to come by, it needs to be clear that this is based on a database of data that's been collected and checked and quality checked. Otherwise, what does it mean?
Exactly, you are right. Okay, we have one question from our attendees, from Dr. Ahmed Fayed. I don't know if you can unmute yourself, or ERF team. Hello. Okay, he is not available. Okay, any questions? Other questions? Okay, he said he cannot unmute himself. I don't know how.
That's strange. And ERF can't unmute him, because I see they muted me and unmuted me.
Okay, I think now he can talk. Dr. Ahmed.
If it's a problem, I mean, people can also contact me if they want to discuss.
Yes, or you can write your question in the Q&A. I don't know if he can talk now. Or you can just write your question in the Q&A and I will read it so Lynn can answer it.
That's a good idea.
Okay.
Can you hear him? I can't hear.
I don't know. No, you can talk now.
Is he not writing it?
No, not yet. Okay, apparently there's an issue with your mic. You can write the question in the Q&A or in the chat, and we read it. Okay.
Did he write it?
No, not yet. I don't know if he's able to hear us or not.
Can you maybe write in the...
Yes, okay, yes, here. So he said data manipulation in developing countries in the global south can be argued to be kind of decreasing over time due to globalization and other reports and data sources. But post-COVID-19, nationalism is on the rise. How will this affect data manipulation in the developing countries in the global south? I will send you the question.
Does he mean data? Do you mean data access? Because, so I understand the comment, the first part of the comment to be that local data sources will become irrelevant because there will be international sources that are more easily available, more accurate, and more trusted than local data sources. And that's true. I mean, for instance, where are we getting our COVID data from? We're getting it from Johns Hopkins University, right? We are not getting it from government sources. Obviously, they are using government sources, but they're collating it, and we trust those sources because it's a big university and it's supposedly the researchers know what they're doing. So I can see that point, but COVID may be making people more inward looking, but it's not necessarily applying to data, especially not socioeconomic data.
I think he can talk now.
Okay.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Sorry for this technical glitch. Thank you, Rasha, for giving me the floor, and thank you, Lynn, for this interesting talk and this answer. Let me add by adding one other argument. So, building on your answer, so how we're always skeptical about official data. Like sometimes, even if the government wants to actually produce proper data, they don't have the capabilities to actually produce rigorous data. So how can we get over this skepticism? How can we sometimes be kind of, I wouldn't say 100%, 100%, have 100% belief in like the reliability in the data, but like how can we actually have a 95% confidence in this data, especially that, again, researchers, the ones on the ground collecting data, sometimes they actually kind of forge data or like they manipulate the data one way or another. So how can we make sure that this is not happening? Of course, we need to train, blah, blah, blah. It's like, what is the key aspect that you, out of your 20 years of experience in developing countries, have reached? Thank you very much.
You've come to the right place for that answer because there's one word: access. So when I lecture, I always talk about the virtuous cycle of reuse. Is that governments who make their data available improve their data? First of all, two ways. One is they know that everybody's looking at that data. As soon as you put your data out there, everybody's looking at it. So you want to make it as accurate as possible. You can't make up data because people will pull you up for it. That's number one. Number two is the more data is out there being used, the more likely the errors in the data will be exposed and reported back to the data collectors so that they can improve their data collection methods. And that is what I mean by the virtuous cycle of data reuse. As data is used more, it becomes better, it becomes more trusted. If it becomes more trusted, it's being used more. And that we've seen that pattern in South Africa. So during apartheid, you couldn't get data at all. Very closed government. That wasn't collecting data for most South Africans. So you would have a small subset of households that would be enumerated, and that data wasn't even made available. And in the 90s, in the late 80s and the 90s, academics started demanding data, and that's one reason why. I mean, that led to a huge questioning of the system of apartheid. And actually, I worked for a unit at UCT that was very involved in that and did a major poverty survey in South Africa. And the government was not publishing poverty statistics. And they used data from small surveys, but also from a massive survey that was conducted by my university to report on what was actually happening in South Africa as far as poverty was concerned and total inequality. And that was a huge shift in socioeconomic research, policy research in South Africa, because that really built the economics and social research based on detailed data. And my university is still the top university in South Africa for producing and for analyzing low-level data and for policy research. So again, we had post-apartheid, we had a planning minister who quoted the famous economist and said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I would say, if you can't find the data, you can't measure it, and therefore you can't manage it. And he was immediately appointed somebody in our stats office who had a very open approach, and they have for years been putting their data online. It had quality problems, but every data has quality problems. When we started in 2001, one of our tasks was to work with the stats office to improve the quality of the data. And initially there was a little bit of tension because it was feeling like the university's critiquing government. But over the years, we've developed a really healthy working relationship, and to such an extent that they actually at one stage were giving our researchers the beta version of the data to check, and that is great, because the data can only get better the more eyes that are looking at it. So yeah, my assertion would be, the more open the government is about their data, the more likely their data is to be trusted. And actually, I even have a slide on that in my presentation, which might have been whizzed over rather quickly. And I've seen it happen in South Africa, and actually done a lot of training in other African countries of stats agencies that have become more or less open, and you can see the difference in the trust in their data.
Okay. Thank you, Lynn. I don't think there is any other question. So just before finishing this session, as we are talking about our data, I have, as an economist and researcher, to thank ERF for making a lot of data sets available online now, concerning labor data surveys or household surveys. I think it changed research in the region for the past 10 years. So I would like to thank them as we are talking about data and data accessibility. Thank you, Lynn and Zuhair, for these interesting papers and presentations. I would like to thank the attendees for their participation and for all the questions. And stay tuned for the coming ERF annual conference webinars in July and August. And thank you all. And we'll finish it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.